everybody. I'd like to start off this week with a quick recap. Now, last week we talked about two twins of intellectual revolutions. The first that I'm going to touch on is the Enlightenment, although it comes chronologically a little bit later than its sibling. And the Enlightenment deals with the struggle to find a universal social truth about humanity, human worth, the nature of government, and what it means to be a human being. Do we start off more talented than others, or more virtuous, or more intelligent, or more um, human than other people? Or are we born equal? And our environment and our society and the way that we interact with each other is what shapes us into what we become, what we could have become, and what we will never become. Now, the scientific revolution is kind of like the Enlightenment, except it deals with things that interact without human interference. So, celestial bodies, gravity, mathematics, physics, you name it. And these are searching to find the underlying fundamental building blocks of the universe. What makes objects, events, forces come into being, and how do they interact with each other? And although these two seem very far apart, one is dealing with humans only, the other is dealing with non-humans or non-living things only, they do share a commonality that they are both on a road towards perfection, if you will, or towards truth. Will there ever be a absolute stopping point to questions that arose during the Enlightenment and even before? Because it's not just the Enlightenment that posits these, it's just the Enlightenment that popularizes them and makes them more accessible to more people, democratizes, for lack of a better term. Or is it an ongoing dialectic? I like to think that it's an ongoing dialectic, that there is that conversation back and forth, that we will never truly reach an end point, but we will make things better bit by bit, moment by moment, discovery by discovery, conversation by conversation. And that's the power of these two twin revolutions, is the idea that there doesn't have to be an end point and we go, okay, we know all there is to know about something. We can just forget about the rest of it and no longer be curious. It sparks that innate human curiosity about what lies over the next hill, what lies around the next bend, what lies on the next level of social interaction. And that's exciting. Now we're going to keep those in mind as we move on to Africa and Asia. I've got two continents that I'm going to try to cram into one particular lecture. So do bear with me, and you may have to rewind some of this. You may have to go back over this. Do take good notes. I would recommend take light notes as you listen and go through, then go back and pick up points that you may have missed. Like, oh, I really needed to think about this issue that Professor Hinckley brought up. That's probably the best way for you to approach these two. Now, of course, because we have such limited time and we have such deep subjects to delve into, we are unfortunately going to be very, very finite in the topics that we're going to approach. In particular, when we talk about Africa, the dominant dialogue about Africa in the early modern period is about the slave trade. And yes, I will touch on the slave trade and some of the implications of that, but I will also talk about another area of Africa on the opposite end of the continent where we can see perhaps how things could have been different if circumstances had also been different. Then we will move on to Asia. We'll talk about the two big societies of Asia, that is Japan and China. We're not going to touch too much on any other Asian society, unfortunately, again, due to time restraints. but they also offer insights into how the world might have been different, how the interactions with different societies might have been different, and maybe gives us an idea as to why things unfolded in history the way that they did. So let's compare a little bit between Africa and Asia before we dive too deep in. So in Africa, in general, there is direct contact with Europeans starting about the 15th century and early 16th century. It's relatively unlimited. Europeans are able to trade with a variety of people up and down the coasts of Africa for really several hundred years in most cases. And most of the wealth in Africa is based on export. And this is true about most pre-modern societies, pre-industrial revolution societies. A lot of the wealth is not generated internally, but through trade. The majority of the trade, especially in West Africa, comes from salt, gold, and exotic items as well, but also slaves. Historically, Africa has been trading slaves towards the Mediterranean for centuries. So there is a certain level of wealth that is generated by the exportation and exploitation of human labor. Now, in Asia, direct contact with the Europeans starts once again in the late 15th, early 16th century. So the late 1400s, early 1500s. And unlike Africa, however, the very centralized governments, the very strong militarized governments, are able to firmly restrict European access to those markets. Why? Well, partly because of centralization, partly because of distance traveled, and also partly because of the just the nature of those societies. Again, Asian societies in Japan and China are wealthy because of exports that they make. China far more so than Japan, although Japan's no slouch, but China is definitely the 800-pound gorilla of the Asian set, and a lot of that is based on exotic exportations. So things like silks and dyes, certain foods, teas, spices, that sort of thing. Other societies have similar wealth. India, who I do not touch on in this lecture, also has exports that are very, very lucrative, and they have very centralized societies that are very wealthy. And they kind of straddle the middle ground between the African and Chinese experiences. So that out of the way, we're going to move on a little bit more. There are some more comparisons that are important to understand. Um, Africa throughout the 16th century into the very beginning of the 19th century experiences a relative decline in the power vis-a-vis Europe. They also experience a level of exploitation that other societies except the Western Hemisphere do not experience. And that's largely due to a conspiracy of circumstances. A lot of fragmented governments, no massive empire at the time. There is a lot of internal um, forces that are at work here, as well as the external pressure. And so this depletion in Africa through those 3 centuries does affect Africa as we move into the 19th century, when we start talking about colonialism and the establishment of direct European control over the African continent. And some historians would even argue that this depletion that began in the 1600s, in 1500s rather, uh, does have this kind of weight to it that predisposes Africa to the exploitation of the 19th century and compounds the kind of underdevelopedness of the 20th century and beyond. Now, that's not to say that African societies are all impoverished, fractured, fragmented, or whatever. That is absolutely not true. There are some cases of civil wars, of abject poverty, of unbelievable burden placed upon the working and the poor and the rural? Absolutely. But there are also some African countries, for example, Kenya, uh, South Africa, and some in like Algeria that are actually not too bad off, that are relatively affluent, that are relatively advanced, and are competing fairly vigorously on the 21st century world stage. But as a continent, in general, Africa does have a bit of an uphill climb in the modern period and into the contemporary period. Comparatively, Asian societies really are experiencing not so much a decline, but more a rise in European power. And so there becomes this kind of parity between the European influence and attempts to get into the market and the attempts to control by these Asian societies. And it's largely due to reactions to those outsiders, the initial reactions, the necessity of trade, how to deal with outsiders who don't particularly conform to your ideals and your laws. And then that leads us into the 19th century. And I think that that focus on parity, that focus on trying to maintain the status quo, may be making Asian societies a little um, inflexible. And so when the 19th century comes around, there's some nasty surprises waiting for places like Japan and China. So Africa. We're going to talk a little bit about slaves, trade, and labor, as well as foreign relations. Now, what we know, and we've touched on before, and we kind of hinted at this before, is that slave trade has existed in Africa for centuries. Now, Africa's not the only one to trade slaves. Absolutely not. The Mongols had slaves, the Romans had slaves, the English took, well, de facto slaves in Ireland in the 1600s by putting down some insurgencies that threatened the puritanical Commonwealth under Cromwell. So it's not like Africa is unique. What is different, however, is the structure that was put in place has existed almost without interruption for hundreds of years. So European exploitation of the Western Hemisphere, which is by default labor intensive, we don't have machinery to do the plowing, the drilling, the mining, the lumber cutting, the processing, that sort of thing. So a lot of that has to be done by physical manual labor. Is a perfect partner in many ways for this existing infrastructure to provide relatively cheap labor. Now, the level of trade through those 3.5-ish centuries is astounding. Now, numbers are rather difficult to pin down. Some conservative estimates say somewhere around 3 million Africans were transported over the intervening centuries to the Western Hemisphere and beyond to act as forced labor. Some more liberal estimations put it somewhere closer to 9 or 10 million. So we're going to split the difference and put it somewhere around 6-ish millions. This also elides this astoundingly big number. Also elides the type of slaves that were sent. Usually, almost invariably, women were exploited because they were typically less powerful than men were, both socially and politically, but also because they provided an important connection to foreign traders. So about 60 to 65% of slaves traded were actually women who were sent over to holdings abroad as part of forced labor. Uh, and the forced marriage that I mentioned before, those so-called temporary marriages, were a way to seal social contracts as a prelude to financial contracts. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you are a Portuguese sailor or Portuguese merchant, if you are coming into a foreign land, you don't really have a lot of connections. So maybe your contacts in a certain society, a certain kingdom, a certain village, or whatever, says, well, just marry into it and you become kind of like family, like an extended clan, or you become a citizen, kind of like getting your green card kind of thing. And so you temporarily marry a woman, a local woman, who acts as an intermediary. And some of these women do become powerful in and of themselves, participate fairly strongly in the slave trade as um, factors for their quote unquote husbands, their foreign husbands. Now, did many of these foreign sailors, whether they were Dutch or Portuguese or English or French or whatever, did they take these marriages seriously? Some seem to have, and they have these African brides that they come back and visit, and they have a home that they build in Africa, all the while trading in human misery in human flesh. And so those women would have properties to hold, they would have monies to spend, and it's a way for them to climb, kind of jump out of their traditional social structure and climb to a higher level, kind of like a shortcut in a way. Now, this is not true for all women. There were some women who were used and left, or used and repeatedly used and used and used by other people, kind of like forced prostitution, not very dissimilar to human sex trafficking now. So yes, the majority of women who were used in this way as this kind of bridge between cultures were indeed essentially sex slaves, if you were, used as both a bargaining chip and a kind of reward for foreign travelers, foreign merchants. So this leads to give you a little bit of the insight of how deep this exploitation goes and how deeply personal it can be for some people. Now, what we do know is that West African societies, as I kind of, I'm going to give you a general star here, roughly where the Songhai or the Ghanese Empire or the Mali Empire is. The majority of the trade was providing labor for plantations that were overseas. And some of these plantations were in relatively northern climates, cold climates, and some of these plantations were in more tropical climates. Regardless of where they were, however, they were extremely labor intensive, as I mentioned before. Growing of sugarcane. Imagine how much physical labor has to go into raising sugarcane. Sugarcane by itself is kind of like a grass. It needs to be weeded. It needs to be tended very closely. When it's harvested by hand with a type of knife. It is then fed into a kind of grinder that extracts the sap, if you will. Imagine it's sugarcane is kind of like a bamboo looking kind of grass, and that sap that comes out isn't terribly sweet. It's a little sweet, but it's not terribly sweet. Well, that has to be boiled in order to get some impurities and water and things like that out, all the bitterness out of it. And that boiling, it takes a lot of energy. So you've got to chop firewood for that. You've got to tend the fires. You've got to tend the machinery. Then that boiled sap, which becomes molasses, can then be further refined. There is a process by which that sugar goes from kind of a liquid to a clumpy brown thing, like dark brown sugar, and then eventually light brown sugar, and then eventually granulated sugar, much like turbinado, kind of got a tannish color to it. And then to get the pure white sugar, which is the most refined sugary, has the highest level of sugar content comparatively. There's even more processing that's all done by hand. So there's a lot of dangerous machinery, a lot of dangerous uh, fires, the chemical processing, the using of bone char to to bleach the sugar, for example. You need to do a lot of slaughtering, a lot of roasting of bones and charring of bones to make them white. which then helps bleach the sugar, and then it has to be packaged and processed and sent off, and that also is all very labor intensive. So really makes you look at a spoonful of sugar in a different light, especially in the pre-modern period. So as I mentioned before, though, most of the slave trade went from West Africa into basically the Mediterranean, where mostly the Middle East was the largest buyer by the time we get to about 1500. And that's due in no small part to the wealth of the Middle East and, of course, labor-intensive farming practices. However, it was a relatively, compared to the Atlantic slave trade, a relatively small amount of slaves that were traded. So, for lack of a better term, sustainable, if you were. Also, moreover, in Middle Eastern kingdoms, there wasn't a racial component that was associated with it. There was a little bit of racial superiority, absolutely, but conversion to Islam, the ability to eventually marry into the larger community to free yourself. Some people did die in slavery, but also a good portion of those people were also able to free themselves, either through the largest of their masters or through reforms in laws or whatever. So, being enslaved from Africa in the Middle East wasn't necessarily a lifelong thing, and it wasn't necessarily excluding you from the wider society. Now that fades away as we move into the 1500s and further into 16 and 1700s, and really is pretty much gone by the time we reach the end of the 1700s and beginning of 1800s. In its place, the kingdoms that were located more inland collapse, and you get the emergence of these small city-states and warlord kingdoms further on the western coast, taking advantage of the European need for labor. And so a lot of slaves were eventually transported over into the Western Hemisphere. I touched upon that number. It is, again, very difficult to pin an exact number down, largely because of the documentation, the smuggling of slaves, the stealing of slaves through piracy or through appropriation or wars. And yeah, you get competing records. So it really becomes hard to pin down exactly how many slaves were sent over to the Western Hemisphere. And so it becomes kind of a trade. The slave trade becomes a trade without conscience. If we think about the way that maybe some of us approach purchasing things now, we think about, well, where is this coming from? Is it fair trade? Is it organic? Is it from a company that treats their workers well? Is it, is there some social awareness to the purchasing? Well, that is not unique to our 21st century lifestyle. There was a lot of thought put into where do products come from in previous centuries, except for when it comes to slavery. Somehow, slavery just kind of becomes another form of commodity, another form of commerce. So humans are no different than sugar or furniture or lumber, for lack of a better term. And to make matters worse, although there is a lot of clannishness and standoffishness between societies, even within Europe, for example, living within one particular region of France. Maybe you look down your nose at the people who live in Belgium or in another portion of France. So there is that to begin with. That's exacerbated and made much, much more culturally acceptable through dehumanizing exercises that are justified through racial theories and even the manipulation of biblical passages. And at the heart of it all, however, is the need for labor in order to meet profits. And we talk a lot in our modern society about capitalism being unconscionable and being cold-hearted. Well, slavery was unconscionable and cold-hearted even before the writing of the the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 1776. So it's not unique. but it is something that does need to be attended to. And this is a question that people will struggle with throughout the Enlightenment about what is the nature of philosophical truth. What is the nature of human existence? How can we be equal if we're enslaving other people? And I mentioned last week about Thomas Jefferson saying that this would be quite the question, and it was something that he and his generation struggled with and didn't really try to solve terribly much. Now, there's also some truth to the fact that African participation was critical in the continuation of the slave trade. Absolutely true. These fractured nations, the collapse of the Songhai Empire and the Mali Empire, the smaller kingdoms were competing with each other. And so a lot of times the goods that were traded to Western African kingdoms came in the form of guns, which made it easier to get new slaves and to exert power over rivals, made it even easier for um, competitors to unseat powerful rivals, made it possible for an insurrection, made it possible for competition. So there's this level of violence and guns that are kind of cyclical in the continuation of slaves. So you needed more slaves to buy more guns to fight against the other people who were going to take your people as slaves, but then if you defeated them, you could sell their people off as slaves. And it becomes this weird, very vicious cycle. And in historical perspective, we see that this trade, this kind of no guardrails, no holds barred trade in slaves was very short-term benefit at the cost of long-term stability and long-term viability. And unlike other resources that could be exploited, whether it's silver or cocoa or sugar or potatoes or honeybees or whatever, unlike those other resources, the exploitation and exportation of human labor was a unique resource that leads to the inability of Western African societies to compete, to be healthy, to to resist forces beyond its control. So what am I talking about? One of the problems is when you export the people who do the fishing, you can't catch as many fish. If you're exporting the people who are growing guava, you can't eat as many guavas. If you're exporting the people who are mining salt and gold, you have less salt and gold to export. And so it leads to this kind of another aspect of that vicious cycle of you need to export more people in order to have more money coming in, but the more people you export, the less likely that you are to be able to wean yourself off of that uh, slavery cycle. Now, an aspect that plays a part in both the instigation of slave trade within Africa and the racial uh, component that arises in the Atlantic world. And when I say Atlantic world, any country that basically touches the Atlantic Ocean. So that's what we refer to as the Atlantic world as historians. So the racial component that arises placing black people at kind of the bottom of the social hierarchy has a certain social appeal that makes it a little bit more tolerable to continue to engage in this horrific, dehumanizing, and oftentimes genocidal uh, aspect of world history. There's first off, there is a social appeal in the sense of giving a feeling of superiority. And For example, Europeans begin to feel more superior over other societies. Now, remember in the previous lectures, we talked about how them showing up in China or in India made them feel inferior. If they showed up in the Middle East, they were made to feel inferior. In this way, the trade made some Europeans feel like they were superior over somebody else. It also appealed within the African societies because they saw their tribe as superior to other tribes, or they saw their racial, their not necessarily racial, but ethnic minority as superior to other ethnic minorities, as a good example. Also, once the slaves were in the system, once they were in the plantation system and working the land, a lot of times poor Europeans or poor natives were unemployed. They found themselves suddenly without a means to support themselves. Well, racial hierarchies, this racial component, allows them a level of comfort. Like I may be poor, I may be unemployed, but I'm not a pathetic slave who is little better than a donkey or a little better than a goat or a little better than a dog or something like that. So there's a comfort in being able to kick the smaller person, as the picture shows here. It's a little bit easier to beat up the small guy than it is to try to rebel against the strong guy. And there is that level of cognitive dissonance that happens even though we were talking at the same time that the slave trade was happening, there was this Enlightenment period in Europe that dealt with ideas of universal freedoms or universal truths or universal equality. Thomas Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, when he says all men, what do we mean all men? Are you using men literally, like males? Okay, if so, then why aren't black males free? Why aren't Asian males free? Why aren't Native American males free? Well, okay, so then if those people can't be associated with slavery, there's got to be a reason why or if they can't be associated with freedom, there's got to be a reason why they're not worthy and therefore are have to be enslaved. But then if you're looking for a universal truth, then this truth that all men are created equal is not universal and endowed by the creator with certain inalienable rights. Obviously, those rights can be alienated. That kind of cognitive dissonance becomes a very difficult question for intellectuals in Europe and the Western Hemisphere to deal with. And it does take a long time and many, many struggles and lots of pushing against a system that is really entrenched in keeping the money flowing and keeping the status quo. But it does happen, sometimes violently, as in the case of the American Civil War, sometimes not violently, as in the case of uh, English decrees against slavery in 1833 um, in the wider empire. Now, so if we're talking about worthiness, worthiness and indeed whiteness becomes very subjective. Who is white? Who is not white? And who stands at the apex? And it becomes very malleable, very slippery. This definition of race. Are English people white? Well, they're descended from Anglo-Saxons, and there's also some Normans in there. So there's also some Norse blood in there, and then well, there's also the Celts that live there. So who are we talking about is worthy of being white? Well, obviously not the Anglo-Saxons who stayed in Germany. Obviously, they're less white than how? How does that work? It's a very strange, slippery subject to determine whiteness and the hierarchy there. And that again is also another struggle that ironically persists well into the 20th and now even in the 21st century. God help us all. So throughout the centuries, Europe is increasingly justifying slavery based on racial archetypes and racial differences. It's in a historical sense, a patently false justification that is used to excuse exploitation, monetary exploitation of human labor. The Enlightenment eventually does question slavery, and in fact, Thomas Jefferson, for all the guff that I'm giving him, he does write about the struggle of slavery, and there was an attempt to free slaves in the Declaration of Independence, but it was struck because he knew that the majority of people that he needed to be on board for rebelling against the British Empire would have objected to that and would not have signed on board. So you would have had a much smaller rebellion, might have probably been put down, and it'd be just the United States would be a footnote in the history of the world. So Europeans are struggling with this. Europeans are doing their best to turn a blind eye. Africa as well is doing its best to turn a blind eye, but eventually, as the population depletes the potential in the future for Africa, that blind eye can't be turned, especially as certain events unfold in the late 1700s. European slavers are really become not welcome anymore. There's this cultural shift as they realize, perhaps a little too late, that wow, we've been giving away a lot of our indigenous labor for relatively cheap, easy short-term returns. And so some historians of West Africa in particular will say that this was this kind of like filtering down of the Enlightenment ideas and maybe their own spiritual realizations that they're betraying Africans for the benefit of people who are just going to turn around and exploit us. Um, Others say that it was more of a pragmatic approach. It was realizing that, oh man, we don't have enough to man the armies. We don't have enough to feed the people. We don't have enough to rebuild our infrastructure, that sort of thing. There's a pragmatic approach. I think it's somewhere between the two. I think it is a little of column A, a little of column B. Now, there is a matrix of influence that happen in any particular historical event, and towards the middle of the 1700s, there really is a collapse in the consensus of slave trade for within Africa. And part of that is the flow of money is not nearly as lucrative as it initially was hundreds of years ago. There's less money coming in for labor, and the labor becomes more precious. So the price of labor goes up, but you're not really getting good prices for that. You have this influx of guns, so everybody is armed. It's making it more difficult to get more slaves. So there's a little bit of that pragmatism thrown in there. There's also a collapse um, of the agricultural system. Farmers tend to be relatively easy to target when you are looking for quick slaves to get. It's not like they can run away. Eventually, they will be back for their farm or their belongings or their animals or whatever. So, farmers, for example, were a very easy group to target, especially women who were often left unattended while the men were maybe working in the fields or the women were caring after children. So, those were too easy pickings to get at, so you can't have people defending all the women all the time. So this leads to famine. Famine means a lack of food to be had. That famine makes even the people who don't die of starvation relatively weak, as fewer calories, less nutrition is coming in. So immunologically, you are more susceptible to disease, so the spread of pestilence. And this, of course, kind of compounds that already tense situation of I'm worried that my neighbor is going to raid my people. So when you start feeling desperate, when you start feeling hungry, and you start looking around for maybe extra food, extra labor, or at least some recompense, or maybe vengeance for stealing people from your group. So there's this outbreak of wars. And so in the middle of the 1700s, there's a lot of these internal wars that eventually culminate in some laws that are passed that ban the sale of slaves, except for those who are convicted criminals. So you have to be convicted criminals. And to this day, if one were to interview people living in West Africa who had been living there the entire time. Many of them believed that the only slaves that were traded were those who were criminals. They were criminals or they were insane or something like that. There are way too many people who were traded, way too many people who were exploited for that to be completely true. But this is a fiction that was kind of retconned into history for the West African kingdoms, saying, no, we never really traded on them. It was only the worst of the worst that we gave over to the Europeans. So what's the upshot? Well, the upshot is Africa has this massive workforce depletion over the course of several centuries. They have strong competition locally, and they have strong international competition that is making their standard of living decline over those centuries. And you have a very decentralized society. No real big empire arises to take the place of the Songhai Empire, which had this big central authority and ruled for over a century until its collapse in the early 1600s. Nothing really takes its place. So you have a very decentralized, fractious society on the western portion of the African continent, and this makes them um, relatively easier to exploit when we come into the 19th century and we talk about colonialism. Now, all countries in Europe benefited from the slave trade, and to a degree, the societies over in the Western Hemisphere benefited from the slave trade, this influx of slaves. And similarly, just like they benefited, so too did those racial policies, those racial hierarchy policies flourish in those areas as well. Now, we've been mostly talking about West Africa and the impact of slave trade on West Africa, and it's easy for that to become the dominant conversation when we talk about Africa in the early modern period to the early contemporary period. But let's focus instead on some other areas, particularly Eastern Africa and Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia in the late 20th century kind of got this reputation of being an impoverished country, but it wasn't true for all of history. Before 1500, before Europeans made direct contact, Ethiopia was actually a relatively wealthy, relatively strong society that occasionally invaded across the sea, usually the Red Sea, invaded places like Yemen and the Saudi Peninsula, would send troops up the Red Sea and attack Egypt, and sometimes fought against the Ottoman Empire. Historically, the Ethiopian um, country was linked to the ancient Aksum and the Sheba tribe. The Queen of Sheba, for example, figures prominently in the Bible and is the kind of paramour, quasi paramour of Solomon, King Solomon from the Bible. So they have this history of long standing dynasties with strong leadership, and they're able to extend their empire across Africa and the Arab Peninsula. So they are in no ways any slouches. Um, they are a predominantly Christian society, having adopted Coptic Christianity from Egypt hundreds of years ago. So it's a kind of majority Christian society with a minority of Jews, non-monotheists, and to a lesser degree, at least in 1500, of Muslims. These minorities are relatively restive, perhaps not as integrated into Ethiopian society as they could be. And in about 1500, the big rival for the Ethiopians is actually the Ottoman Empire, which is trying to extend its control down the western portion of the Arab Peninsula and control the cities of Mecca and Medina. So they sometimes come into conflict with Ethiopia. Now, the Ethiopians had this trading alliance with what were called Swahili or coast livers, the people who lived on the coast, the Swahili people who would act as intermediaries in the trade with Asia, India, and Micronesia. So when we come to the 1500s, about the middle of the 1500s, Ethiopia is actually under quite a bit of pressure. You have the Ottoman Empire that is coming in across the Red Sea, coming across into Yemen and Oman, and then on top of it, you've got these Jewish Highlanders, or these, for lack of a better term, they are people who live in the mountains, the mountainous regions, who are waging an insurgency against the Ethiopians. So we've got two forces that are really pushing from the north and the west and the east that are pushing Ethiopians further and further away from their normal trading partners, the Swahili. Even some Swahili uh, tribes get involved in this war because, hey, you could probably capture some land, some wealth. Why not take advantage of somebody who's relatively weak? On top of that, we have an interior that is increasingly destabilized. That there's some famine, a little bit of religious tension and tribal tension that's making life difficult for the Ethiopians. Into this picture of just a very besieged society comes the Portuguese. The Portuguese arrive shortly after the direct contact uh, with with India, so in the early 1500s. And here come the Portuguese, and the Portuguese offer the Ethiopians something that they cannot pass, and that is that the Portuguese will defend their Christian brothers. And the Portuguese sell weapons. They sell their services as patrolmen to make sure that the Ottomans can't interject navies into Ethiopia. They kind of put down some of these Swahili coastal cities that are part of the pressure against the Ethiopians. And the Ethiopians begin to see the Portuguese kind of as a necessary evil, because along with those guns and the much needed naval support, the Portuguese are also bringing Jesuit missionaries to try to convert the Ethiopian people to Roman Catholicism rather than Coptic Christianity. Well, the although the assistance of the Portuguese is much needed and indeed does turn the tide. The Ethiopians are not particularly keen to engage in a long-term relationship with the Portuguese. There's that religious difference between Roman Catholicism and Coptic Christianity. Plus, the Portuguese are pretty much laying down very lopsided offers for trade. The Ethiopians are unfortunately forced to agree to some of these. They're kind of stuck in a no-win situation, what historians refer to as gunboat diplomacy. In other words, being forced to trade at cannon point or gun point. And part of it is the um, Ethiopians can't just say no to the Portuguese, because if the Portuguese leave, then here come the Ottoman again, here come the Swahili, here come Muslims, here come raiders. We're really just stuck in a no-win situation. So in a way, the Ethiopians were exchanging one onerous opponent who is trying to impose their will upon them for another that's slightly less evil. So the lesser of two evils, if you will. However, this begins to change in the 1600s as more European uh, navies begin to ply the waters of the Indian Ocean. The Ethiopians come into contact with the Dutch, the French, the Spanish to a lesser degree, and of course the English. And they begin to make deals, better deals with the Portuguese than they did with the Portuguese, to essentially eject the Portuguese. The Portuguese basically overstayed their welcome. They had a good 80-year run-ish, right around 80 years, relatively exclusive trade with the Ethiopians that was extremely lucrative. The French, English, and Dutch wanted a piece of that pie and offered better terms, and luckily were on military parity with the Portuguese. And so the Ethiopians allied with these new European powers to get rid of their old buddies, the Portuguese. Uh, the result was a collapse um, of the Ethiopian central monarchy. That history of long-standing strong dynasties was basically fractured by both the wars with the Muslim and Jewish outsiders, as well as the struggle against the Portuguese. And so Ethiopia kind of devolves into this um, kind of coalition of aristocracies, and they don't really have a strong king or queen to lead them. They do have a figurehead, but it's very decentralized. And so you have this aristocracy that is really ascendant in Ethiopia. Luckily, because there's so many willing opponents who are more than happy to sell arms and expertise, as well as some very nasty lessons learned about Europeans, the Ethiopians begin to become very suspicious and kind of xenophobic about Europeans. And at the same time that they're purchasing guns, that they're purchasing arms and armament and expertise in building up fortresses with Western expertise in architecture, they're also planning to get rid of Europeans. And so they become very suspicious of outsiders, not necessarily closed off, but very suspicious of outsiders, very controlling of outsiders, and they become the only African society not to be colonized in the 19th century, and they maintain their independence well into the 20th century. They also are one of the only African nations that does not engage in any kind of slave trade. They already have enough problems as it is. Perhaps they understood on a level that maybe the Western kingdoms didn't, or maybe the opportunity never really arose to begin trading slaves. Maybe it's also that the trade in slaves from Ethiopia was less vibrant than it was from West Africa. I don't know. There's a lot of different factors that play in there, but the reality is Ethiopia remains a relatively strong, relatively stable society well into the 20th century, before mechanized warfare comes to its doors. The Italians even tried to invade in the 1880s, and the Ethiopians actually defeat them fairly handily as well, as it turns out. So the Ethiopians are not to be messed with. They're a very robust country, at least into the 19th century. So what lessons can we take away from Africa now that we're about an hour into our lesson? Well, West Africa is dominated by the slave trade, and that slave trade is predicated upon exploitation not only of people, but also of land and of resources and of labor. This leads to a level of depletion that is unmatched in other parts of Africa. West Africa becomes very ripe for colonization, and thus is vulnerable to those outside influences. Ethiopia is a Christian state that happened to be desperate in desperate straits and was taken advantage of. At least that's their interpretation historically, and leads to a consolidation of their society and a relative xenophobia towards Europeans moving into the 19th and 20th centuries. And let's shift gears. And this is a good time to stop if you want to go back over some of that stuff that we talked about Africa, taking those light notes, then going back. Go ahead and do that now, and then come back to this timestamp to pick up for about Asia, because we're going to talk about dynastic stability, European influence, and how that may have helped or hindered these Asian societies, and grappling with modernity. Now, China has a long history of centralized authority, with a very strong bureaucracy and a very controlled society. A lot of people online or even in Western countries now look at China and China's authoritarian policies and say that's anathema to the way societies should work. To the Chinese tradition, however, what is anathema is the idea of individualism. That most of the history of China, stretching back thousands of years, is very much more community and dynastically oriented. That's not saying that they didn't have rebellions; they absolutely did. And in fact, when we pick up when the Europeans come to visit the Chinese have just overthrown the Mongol Yuan dynasty and gone through a very long, protracted civil war, and so there's a need to kind of consolidate and keep the society predictable and orderly and harmonious. External trade for China was good, but it's not vital the way that it was for Africa. There's a lot of methods by which China could generate money, not the least of which are these long-standing trade routes that still stretch across uh, most of Eurasia and into Africa and Europe that are still generating a fairly good amount of money. So it's not necessarily a need to trade. Uh, it's just kind of a good thing, right? Just have a little bit extra trade, but they want to control it. They don't want these Europeans running willy-nilly all over China, creating havoc and disrupting the harmony of the very ordered society. This is an outside element that is, not really conducive to a continued stable society. There's also no real competition for China. You're not going to go to China's nearest rivals and get the quality, amount, and breadth of products that you are in China. So there's not really a competition, and China doesn't really necessarily desperately need Europeans to show up on its doorstep. It's had centuries of other peoples showing up with similar amounts of silver and gold. Japan, by contrast with China, is when the Europeans arrive in the midst of an ongoing about 100-year civil war. Europeans are necessary, but much like the Ethiopians, they're kind of a necessary evil. Like we'll tolerate them because of what they bring and the opportunities they provide. And then once everything is settled, much like Ethiopia also, Japan begins to consolidate and control the society, which means that external trade and even interaction with outside worlds is not necessarily important. It becomes increasingly unimportant. At one point in the shogunate, as we get into the 1700s, trying to trade abroad is the equivalent of piracy according to the laws. So even if you're not stealing from somebody else, you're somehow a pirate and can lead to death. So the merchants who traded overseas were often seen on par with pirates or privateers. So there was a death penalty associated with moving abroad. That's how closed off the society became. So let's talk about the Chinese, and we're not really going to touch on either one of these empires, but this is the period of time that we have the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. These two dynasties are the last two dynasties or um, imperial dynasties of China, and they revisit some of the social structures that had provided stability for China in the past, but also have to grapple with new elements, these new Europeans, these new rising powers that maybe they're not quite equipped to deal. So part of the way that the Ming Dynasty established a relatively ordered and stable society was to lock people down in their professions. So, for example, if your father was a soldier in the military, you had to serve, and your child, your male child, would have to serve in the military. And this was often a very long term of service. It's not like a couple of years. It's not like, oh, you could opt out of it or anything like that. No, you had to serve in the military. Similarly, if you were a craftsman or a farmer or a merchant or an architect or anything, if you followed a certain profession, if you were a bureaucrat, whatever, your children followed you. Well, your male children followed you. Women, by and large, did not participate in the bureaucracy, military, or crafts. Women, of course, did absolutely participate in the creation of products, absolutely did participate in farming and in orchard growing and raising animals and that sort of thing, even in merchant pursuits and selling things and trading. And they often were forced to follow their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, or whatever into those different professions. But most of these rules applied to males. So, if you're an emperor, I want you to think, step yourself into those shoes, and imagine why would you want to decree that military service would be hereditary? You've just finished fighting a civil war. Shouldn't in times of peace, shouldn't you be turning those swords into plows kind of thing? Shouldn't they be releasing the military? Wouldn't that be cheaper to release the military? And what about craftsmen? What if, yeah, maybe I'm a really good woodworker, but maybe my son has two left hands and, really he has no artistic eye whatsoever. What good is it for the emperor to say that, well, craftsmen have to follow in their father's footsteps, or farmers? What if the farmer's son is actually a really good poet, for example? Why wouldn't you want him to become a poet? Why don't you want him to leave that farm? Well, partly this is due to stability and reliability. uh, the Ming dynasty, having defeated the Yuan dynasty, was wary of further invasion, was wary of outsiders. And this is also partly explains some of the xenophobia when it comes to Europeans showing up. There was already that built-in prejudice of outside invaders. And so having a military in place that can be counted on, that can be stable, that can be professionally well trained, makes sense. It seems to offer a level of security. There was some tax reform to alleviate this onerous tax burden that the Mongols had imposed upon the poor in particular, and also a little bit of foresight. One of the decrees of the first Ming emperor was to plant fruit-bearing trees. Now, I don't know if you know anything about fruit-bearing trees, but if you plant a seed, it's going to be literally decades before you see any viable fruit coming off of those trees. Yes, they will have little fruits it fairly early on in their young lives, but those are not very edible fruits. You have to wait for the tree to mature, whether it be apple or cherry or peach or whatever like that. And it comes from this Confucian belief that the wise man plants the tree knowing that he will never enjoy its shade. It's creating stability for future generations, not getting the reward for yourself, thinking ahead about the good of the society. And so that is the core of it, social stability. In part, that social stability was reinforced by a very stringent government reform. There were hereditary positions within the bureaucracy were done away with. Instead, your bureaucracy was quasi meritocracy. That meant that only the best and brightest university students uh, could pass these very tough, rigorous, days-long examinations. Uh, the idea of these bureaucrats being well educated was only the first part of these government reforms. There would be layers of bureaucracy. Rather than the emperor decreeing one law for the entirety of the land, there would be different departments, different bureaus that would deal with different sections of China. And so you had these layers of bureaucracy, kind of like brackets, if you will. And this layers of government meant that each county, each prefecture, each region within those prefecture could could tailor rules, tailor laws, tailor policies that would best affect those regions. So, for example, if you're saying, well, you have to produce X amount of rice, let's say 13 bushels of rice. If you're living in a relatively arid area, maybe rice isn't what you can grow. Maybe it's wheat or millet or barley or something else. Or maybe you live in a relatively desert-like region and most of your goods come from cows and sheep and goats. So maybe instead of fruit or vegetables, you produce meat or milk or wool or leathers. So this ability, this kind of flexibility in the layers of governments were really, really important. And also at the heart of this was to revive the infrastructure. Now remember, we're talking about a civil war that raged across the countryside. Civil wars wreak havoc upon fields and roads and harbors and bridges. If you cut off road access from one county to another, you're not going to have very good communication, trade, commerce. People could theoretically starve, or worse yet, they could incite their own rebellion. And so there was a kind of very flexible way to approach the revivification of infrastructure, of those roads, schools, law enforcement, bridges, you name it. So, as an emperor, why would you want tough government service exams? Why would you only want the people who really, really knew math and philosophy and rhetoric and law to be your ministers? Why would you want more layers of government? Wouldn't fewer layers of government, a more streamlined government, be more efficient? Wouldn't that be a better government? And why would you want better roads, canals, ports, and bridges? I mean, these are expenses that don't really need to be done, do they? Do we really need to dredge a new canal? Do we really need to open new ports or build new bridges? Well, here's where the inherent downside of some of the older traditions of imperial dynastic regime come into play. You have two different types of leaders in general. They fall into two categories. The first is strong leaders, and the second is weak leaders. Now, strong leaders are often insulated from the rest of the empire. They live within a bubble, so they're ignorant of everyday life. They're often poorly informed, and those poorly informed decisions can be disastrous for the country. For example, if you're living in a kind of desert region, if you command the desert region to grow rice, you're going to fail, or more likely, you're going to punish the region for failing to meet your demand. So, also strong leaders have an inability to hear advice and tolerate contradicting opinions, and this can lead to very poor governance. Well, weak leaders often flee responsibility. They're easily influenced by a bunch of different advisors. And so they have this very chaotic temperament that tends to change, very mercurial. And so you have too many voices and too many choices. So those are the downsides of these strong and weak leaders. Now, the upsides is that often these strong leaders are unmoved by advice, so they can make very definitive decisions. The layers of administration that are in place in that bureaucracy allow for a more flexible response by government workers. The government workers are essentially insulated from the whims of the strong leader. And also, strong leaders can be appealed to through vanity, saying, "Oh, great leader, you are so wise and so powerful and so smart and handsome, and you get all the best things, and you have all these wonderful. Oh, goodness, aren't we glad you have your name over everything, whatever." And so you can appeal to their vanity, and that allows certain bureaucrats to manipulate policy and say, oh, well, of course, you would have known that. Didn't you mention that the other year that maybe we needed to fix those bridges or something like that? Now, the upside to weak leaders is that often the weak leaders are poorly educated or they're very shallow in their education, so they can be easily confused. The professional managerial class is a little bit more free to act, saying, oh, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it, that sort of thing. And so a robust, educated government is able to fill that void. So, in a way, the initial decree that you have this strong, robust um, entrance exam allows for professionals who know their job. They know exactly how to get things done. And although you may, sitting in your removed palace, think that you know the way to get things done, maybe you don't. That sort of thing. Now, Ming China does come into contact directly with Europeans. There's a flow of silver not only from Japan during that civil war of purchasing items that are then purchasing guns in particular that then winds up in the hands of Portuguese traders who then wind up showing up in China, but also directly from the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot of silver that's coming from the Western Hemisphere. There's also a lot of food that's coming. Peppers, for example, like hot peppers. A lot of people associate, like particularly Sichuan cuisine with hot peppery foods. A lot of those peppers come directly from the New World, and they found a very vibrant market, a very appreciative market there. But also sweet potatoes, peanuts, new luxuries like tobacco and that sort of thing begin to flood the market. So they expand the diet of the Ming Dynasty in general. And much like, say, the humble potato had this incredible effect on European society, so too do these new foods coming in and these new luxuries coming into Ming China have a similar effect. The population begins to explode. They reach they go from 4 million to about 8 million within about 200 years. So they double their population, which is just this incredible explosion of people. They also begin to be exposed to new technological innovation through Jesuit missionaries who exchange ideas on astronomy and metallurgy and even engage in philosophical change. And you get to see the beginning of the change in Eastern philosophies that the approach to governance, the approach to investment, or the approach to education and social justice begins to expand beyond just social harmony and social stability. Eventually, however, things kind of spiral out of control. One of the things that leads to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty is the blessing and curse that is New World silver. Now, much like the Spanish Empire benefited initially from this massive influx of silver, so too did the Ming Dynasty. And just like the Spanish Empire eventually started to collapse under the weight of inflation, so too did the Ming Dynasty. Wages were not going up, prices, however, were. The cost of food, the cost of doing business, the cost of housing, the cost of fuel, all of that begins to go up, but nobody's really getting any better wages. They're not getting more valuable wages. So this leads to people doing things like abandoning farms. That exacerbated with a prolonged drought leads to, you guessed it, famine. And that famine leads to the spread of diseases and pestilence. That spread of disease and pestilence leads many to become unhappy with the government of the Ming Dynasty. And so you get these rebellions that begin to pop up in order to pay for putting down these rebellions and to make up for the loss of rebellious provinces. Taxes begin to go up. You get suddenly chronic deflation. All the silver is pulled out Suddenly the prices are super high and nobody's earning any money, and those prices collapse because if you can't rent your house for say $1,000 a month, maybe you'll take 800. Can't take 800, nobody's buying for 800. Okay, maybe 700, 600, 500, 400, 200, 100, that sort of thing. So eventually things begin to collapse as the money begins to kind of evaporate from the local economy. Now, the Portuguese arrived in 1514, and when the Portuguese arrived in 1514, they described the Chinese as being white like us, white like the Portuguese, which is a very interesting observation. It makes you wonder about how their journey to get there was like. What was it like? Well, initially they would have had to stop off for water and food all along the African coasts and would have had to stop off in perhaps the Middle East, would have had to stop off in India, where there tended to be darker people. Now they arrive in China and suddenly find people who are relatively pale. So to them, this is a strange revolution. It doesn't quite carry the connotation yet that that racial justification for slavery carries, but you can see the roots of it there because later on, the Portuguese will be kicked of out of China because they begin to engage in slave trade. They begin to capture slaves. Um, the direct trade with China leads to cultural and informational exchanges and perhaps helps fuel some of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The Portuguese were very arrogant, however, and they were eventually kicked out in 1520. So they only stayed for about 6 years before the Chinese got sick of them. And the Chinese wouldn't let them back in for another 37, 38 years when they had to come in and pay this huge, basically apology money and then promise to behave themselves and only trade in certain ports for certain items. Let's jump over to Japan real quick. Again, this is another good time to stop and go back through China and listen to some of those points that you may have had a light note taking with. But we're going to move on to Japan, and this is going to be a much shorter portion, so we're almost done here. Now, the hierarchy of feudal Japan was established over the course of several hundred years, but it basically boils down to a group called the samurai class. The samurai class were initially bureaucrats who became warriors. The warriors would then be the ones who went out and waged most of the wars, so they became the top of the government. You'll notice here there is no aristocracy, there is no imperial hierarchy or bureaucracy above the samurai because the samurai were both bureaucrats and warriors at the same time. And they filled both roles. Now, the emperor, there is a Japanese emperor, but he is mostly a figurehead. The true head of Japan is somebody called the shogun. The shogun is kind of like the commander in chief and is the real power behind the throne. There are some warlords called daimyo, and then below them are the average rank and file samurai. You're born into samurai class, you die in samurai class. Below them in the hierarchy of Japanese society in this feudal period are the farmers and craftsmen. These are the people who provide the day-to-day tools, the buildings, um, the food that you eat, the drinks that you consume, whether it be sake or tea or whatever. And so they are held in higher esteem than the lowest of the low, which are merchants and itinerant workers, people who have no roots. They move around a lot. They're hard to pin down. They're hard to know where they're going to be from one point to another. They're so mobile. Now, when we meet our friends, the Japanese, in this modern period, they're in the middle of a civil war. This civil war has been going on since about the middle of the 15th century, and it will last until the late 16th century. So, as I mentioned before, those daimyo, those warlords, they are trying to compete with each other to become the next shogun, the next commander in chief, if you will. And of course, no daimyo wants to be number two. Nobody enters the presidential race, for example, to become second place. There is no bronze or silver medal for second or third place, so they all want to be the shogun. This war devastates the countryside for over 100 years. Peasants are conscripted into fighting, or if they're not accidentally killed during battles, or if they don't have their fields torn up by battles or whatever like that. This leads to some serious food insecurity within Japan. And then by the time we get to about 1600, the Civil War is pretty much over, and a guy who didn't win, strangely enough, winds up becoming the shogun through political maneuverings and positioning himself in just such a way that he's able to take advantage of certain turns of events. This man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, often referred to as the Old Badger, because um, he was very canny in his strategy and was a very stout fighter, often defensive fighter. But he became an important figure within the hierarchy, and eventually he gets named as shogun. Now his dynasty lasts from 1600 all the way to the mid 1800s, so about 250 years, 262 years, I believe. Um, and this shogunate exerted its power in a few different ways. Um, the emphasis was upon control of Japan and making sure that the society was stable and predictable, much in the same way that the Chinese were. So one of the first things that the shogunate engaged in was what was referred to as the Great Sword Hunt. Now remember all those peasants who had been conscripted into the military? Well, the theory is they have weapons hiding somewhere. We need to get those weapons out of the hands of the peasants. They also, coinciding with this, decreed that only samurai could carry swords. In fact, swords would be kind of a very easy way to identify who is elite in the society and who was not. People carrying swords were by default elite. Samurai, on the other hand, although they could carry those swords, they were not any more free than, say, peasants or merchants or craftsmen. Samurai could only ever be samurai. They cannot be a merchant. They cannot be a moneylender. They cannot be anything other than what they are, which is soldier bureaucrat. They cannot leave the service. They cannot just give up and wander off. It just doesn't happen. To do so would be dishonorable, and you would have to kill yourself or be killed and bring shame and dishonor upon your family. Further, to ensure control of the society, peasants had to acquire passports, basically a little book with the description of what they looked like, how old they were, where they were from, and where they could travel to. You had to obtain permission to move out of your county, even if you were going to go visit a relative, if you were going to visit a shrine to certain gods, whatever, even if you were moving food from one point to another, you had to have a passport. And there were border patrols, which were manned, not surprisingly, by samurai who had the ability to kill you on the spot if you did not have your passport. So that's how controlled the country was. The shogun still had daimyo that he had to control, but now there's no wars to fight. There's no civil war. There's no way to pit one rival against the other. And so they instituted a law that said that the different daimyo, these different warlords, amongst many of the restrictions that they had to come and live in the capital for half the year, and then they had to go back to their home province for half the year. And of course, the daimyo is not going to just show up by themselves with like carry-on luggage and a set of flip-flops or something like that. No, they've got to bring their entire entourage with them. This is a very expensive endeavor. So you imagine you've got all these samurai soldier bureaucrats who are accompanying you. You've got your concubines, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your whatever, and you're moving your whole house. Basically, you're moving every 6 months. Imagine how expensive that is. And that expense keeps the daimyo from being able to raise an army. Because if you do not participate, if you do not show up, well, all the other armies will be more than happy to take your lands away from you if you decide you're going to try to rebel. So, why would the shogun want to disarm peasants? And why would you want samurai to keep working for their lords? Why can't they go off and become musicians or merchants or artists or farmers? Why would you restrict travel? Why would you want to be that harsh about travel? Well, at the heart of it is, again, control. In Tokugawan society, in the Tokugawa shogunate, he and his descendants for the next 260 years will ensure that society is predictable. Now, this leads to ossification, what uh, historians refer to as ossification. In other words, they become like very bony or very stiff, uh, kind of petrified, if you will. And the expense of keeping armies and two houses wears the daimyo down. Lords become indebted to merchants who are still able to move, even though they're considered low on the totem pole socially. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of influence politically, and that's fine for them. They're not looking to move beyond their social hierarchy. They hobnob with the daimyo. They know that the samurai are going to, defer to them. They know that some of these samurai are actually carrying around wooden replicas of their swords because they've sold their swords to maintain their lifestyle, that sort of thing. So it's a very, very a society that's very much like an insect captured in amber, frozen for it seems like eternity. Very little innovation, very little exchange with the outside world, with the exception of Portugal, and then later on the Dutch. Well, Portugal arrives in the tail end of this civil war in about 1543, and the Portuguese, having learned their lessons from previous encounters with other societies, come with a plan this time. They bring Jesuit missionaries to convert the local Japanese to Christianity. They come with guns and they come with silver. They know nothing else is really going to appeal to the Japanese, and so this kind of pragmatic approach lets the Portuguese to be relatively successful in Japan where they aren't elsewhere. And part of this may also be a little bit of curiosity. This is a land that had been mythologized by Marco Polo. And so it was kind of like discovering a whole new world. So the Portuguese begin to spread Christianity. That was later curtailed by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who saw the spread of Christianity as kind of giving the Japanese a chance to have dual loyalty, this kind of loyalty to a spiritual emperor who lives thousands of miles away, who they have no chance of ever actually seeing, and so can therefore be manipulated by these outsiders. The Jesuits learn the Japanese language very quickly. They learn the Japanese customs. They attempt to build bridges to influence Japanese society in a way that missionaries in to other societies, like say Ethiopia or China or elsewhere, don't really do. This is the one time that I would say that the Portuguese are approaching this interaction very intelligently, very strategically. However, the Portuguese eventually find themselves supplanted by Dutch traders, much like the Portuguese were eventually driven out of Ethiopia. So too were they eventually driven out of Japan. There's some really vivid accounts of this expunging of Christian influence within Japan. The Dutch show up and basically say they have no interest in converting the Japanese. They are no friends to the Portuguese or the Roman Catholic Pope. In fact, they say that they don't believe in the Roman Catholic Pope, which makes them okie dokies for Tokugawa Ieyasu's descendants. Uh, so the Dutch traders, when they arrive, they are kind of like an opportunity that Japan was really looking for to get rid of that necessary evil. And so, in order to consolidate this re-exertion of control over Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate orders an artificial island built in Nagasaki harbor, upon which only 13 men may live, no women. If there is to be an exchange, let's say there's somebody is sick and needs to be replaced, like say an emissary from the Dutch. If that person needs to be replaced, well, he has to be taken off the island first, and then a new person is brought on. So there can never be more than 13. Otherwise, the Japanese will set fire to the island and drive the invaders off and crucify everybody and leave them as examples on beaches. So very, very harsh response to anybody who breaks the laws. Now, that's not to say that the Japanese were completely and totally cut off from the idea of outsiders being integrated into their society. Although, in these cases, they are more like exotic pets, maybe, or curiosities. The first known outsider to ever be integrated into Japanese society is a man who is only known by his Japanese name, Yasuki. Yasuki was a black slave that was accompanying some Dutch traders in the late 1570s before they established their presence in the 1580s. Um, the Portuguese traded Yasuki to a daimyo at the time, a man named Oda Nobunaga, in exchange for favorable trade agreements. Now, Oda Nobunaga didn't take him as a slave and understood the concept of slavery, but found him so fascinating, so exotic, and so strange that he instead elevated him to become a personal bodyguard and made him a samurai. Along with being a samurai meant that he was granted lands. He became a landlord. He was given access to women, which he eventually married, and he was given a lifetime pension so that in his old age he may retire. We don't know what happened to Yasuki. We do know that Oda Nobunaga was eventually assassinated. Yasuki disappears from the records at about that time. He was not involved in the assassination, but it may have been that maybe he fell victim to the coup attempt or to the coup that killed Oda Nobunaga. We don't know. Somebody that we do know is a man named William Adams. He was a English navigator or pilot for the Dutch ship that eventually landed in Japan. Now, it landed in 1600. It seems to have been a victim of a typhoon. It was washed ashore with a lot of other Dutch and English sailors. But was it really an accident? Were the Dutch kind of hanging out, hoping that maybe they could engage in maybe a little freelance wealth redistribution with the Portuguese ships that were coming out of Japan? Entirely possible. Was it part of a concerted effort that the Dutch were just going to show up anyway, and they just happened to be caught by a storm? That's also possible as well. But what we do know is that when William Adams washed up on the shore of Japan, the Portuguese argued that the Dutch were basically pirates, the English were basically pirates, and that under Japanese law, they should be crucified. And the Tokugawa shogunate did crucify a couple of sailors just to appease the Jesuits. But the fact that the Jesuits were so eager to get rid of these other traders made Tokugawa Ieyasu curious about them. Eventually, he became curious about William Adams, and Adams began to learn to speak Japanese, became a companion to Tokugawa Ieyasu, and much like Yasuke had been, Tokugawa Ieyasu elevated William Adams to a samurai class, and he became a technical advisor to the shogun and began to teach the shogun how to build European style ships that were far more maneuverable than the Chinese style ships that the Japanese were using. He was likewise given land, women, and a pension. He was already married. He had a family back in England. He would write to them occasionally, but he was forbidden from leaving. He could never leave Japan upon pain of death. So he did wind up dying in Japan, and in fact, his gravestone is still honored today as seeing as this kind of bridge between cultures. And there's his gravestone there, or actually more of a Buddhist shrine, because when he died, they of course disposed of his body the way that Buddhists do, which is just to simply wrap him and bury him. And where he's buried is different from where his shrine is. This particular shrine is at his house where he used to live, and they still light incense and leave offerings for him there. William Adams, just so you know, wasn't a bad father or wasn't a bad husband. He was caught in circumstances beyond his control. He would send money and letters and gifts back to his family back in England, but it's not like you can say no to the Tokugawa shogunate. You don't anger them. Also, if he went back, let's say, in a perfect world, he decided, oh, I'll go back. He would go back to being just a working class guy back in England where he was living as a lord in Japan, knowing he could never go back again. So, was there the possibility that he wanted to go back? It seems like he really did want to go back, but over time he began to accept his fate and become more comfortable as a kind of adopted Japanese subject. So, let me ask you a few closing questions. So, why was it important for the shoguns to expel Christians? Why was it so important for Japan to close itself off to outsiders, even at the cost of trade with its own people towards China or Indonesia or Vietnam or places like that? Moreover, as the society became more and more closed off, as the samurai became more and more restless, there was an expansion of theater, and along with theater, also an expansion of prostitution and of gambling and of alcohol. Why, as the shogun, if you're controlling all this other stuff, why are you allowing these vices, these societal rots to persist? Is it because maybe on some level you recognize that there has to be some kind of release valve? You have to give them something to do. Maybe. I don't know. So in conclusion, we have Japan and China have two different experiences with their society, but arrive at the same kind of approach to outsiders and to their society in the end. Japan restricts foreign learning, it restricts movement, especially of foreigners, and becomes a highly rigid social society. Now, at the time, maybe it seems like a good idea, but is this a recipe for disaster further on down if you're closing yourself off from the rest of the world? Now, China is more receptive to foreign learning, but still very restrictive of the movement of foreigners. Essentially, they're restricted to one port, much like the Japanese. And although China is a less rigid structure, at least in theory, um, the idea that anybody could really become a bureaucrat, a well-educated bureaucrat, doesn't really play out if you're a poor farmer or a craftsman. Usually, the professional bureaucratic class had enough money to send their children off to be educated, and of course, father and son would share a similar profession. So for China, even though they're slightly more, at least rhetorically flexible, is their rigid social structure a good idea for China, or is it a recipe for disaster further on? All right, guys, that is it for this time. stop now, go back through Japan, and look at the review as well if you're doing that note thing that I was talking about at the beginning. And that's it for this week, and we'll see you again next week.